The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine grounds of Adelaide Cottage, as Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews adjusted her earpiece for the third time in 10 minutes. At 34, she had spent the last 8 years protecting members of the British royal family, but nothing had prepared her for the unique challenges that came with guarding Princess Charlotte of Wales. Charlotte, now 11 years old, was no ordinary child. Born into a life of privilege and protocol, she carried herself with the poise expected of a future queen. Yet beneath that composed exterior lived a spirited young girl who questioned everything around her. Sarah had been assigned as Charlotte's primary protection officer 6 months ago, and in that time she had witnessed the princess navigate the complex world of royal expectations with remarkable grace. The cottage, nestled in the heart of Windsor Great Park, served as the Wales family's primary residence. Unlike the grand palaces associated with royalty, Adelaide Cottage offered a semblance of normalcy that Prince William and Catherine desperately wanted for their children. The 4-bedroom Victorian house, with its ivy-covered walls and traditional English garden, provided a stark contrast to the formal settings where Charlotte would spend much of her adult life. Sarah's day began at 5 in the morning, as it always did. She reviewed security briefings, checked communication systems, and coordinated with the other protection officers assigned to Prince George and Prince Louis. The Wales children maintained busy schedules that required precise planning and constant vigilance. Today would be different, though Sarah didn't know it yet. As she walked through the cottage's security checkpoint, Sarah noticed Charlotte's personal assistant, Mrs. Elena Thornbury, speaking in hushed tones with the household staff. Elena had worked for the royal family for over 15 years and rarely showed signs of distress, but this morning, her usually composed demeanor seemed strained. "Good morning, Mrs. Appeasel."
"Good morning, Miss
Thornbury," Sarah said, approaching the elderly woman who had become something of a surrogate grandmother to the Wales children. "Everything all right?" Elena looked up, her grey eyes reflecting a sadness that immediately caught Sarah's attention. "Oh, Sarah, dear, I'm afraid we've received some rather difficult news. Charlotte's riding instructor, Miss Rebecca Forster, passed away unexpectedly last night." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Rebecca Forster had been more than just a riding instructor to Charlotte. She had been a mentor, confidant, and one of the few adults in the princess's life who treated her as simply Charlotte, not as a future monarch. The 62-year-old former Olympic equestrian had worked with Charlotte for 3 years, helping the young princess develop not only her riding skills, but also her confidence and independence. "How did it happen?" Sarah asked, her mind already racing through the implications of this loss for Charlotte. "Heart attack, apparently. Very sudden. Her nephew called this morning," Elena explained, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "The poor dear was found in her cottage near the stables. She'd been preparing for Charlotte's lesson today." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Charlotte had been looking forward to today's riding lesson for weeks. The princess had been working on mastering a particularly challenging jumping course that Rebecca had designed specifically for her skill level. More importantly, Charlotte had planned to share some exciting news with Rebecca about her recent acceptance into an advanced riding program at the local equestrian center. "Does Charlotte know?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Their Royal Highnesses are telling the children now," Elena replied, glancing toward the stairs that led to the family's private quarters. "Princess Charlotte has been asking for Rebecca since she woke up. She was supposed to help Charlotte prepare for the Windsor Horse Show next month." The Windsor Horse Show held special significance for Charlotte. It would mark her first public appearance as a competitive rider, and she had been training intensively with Rebecca for months. The event represented more than just a horse show. It symbolized Charlotte's growing independence and her ability to excel in something purely her own, separate from royal duties and expectations. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of Charlotte's voice carried down from upstairs. Even from a distance, Sarah could hear the distress in the young princess's tone. The formal protocols that governed royal life included specific procedures for how children should be informed of deaths, particularly those involving people close to them. These guidelines, developed over generations, aimed to protect royal children from emotional trauma while teaching them to handle loss with dignity. However, Sarah had observed Charlotte closely enough to know that the princess processed emotions differently than most children her age. Years of royal training had taught Charlotte to internalize her feelings, to maintain composure even when her world felt like it was falling apart. This emotional restraint, while valuable in public settings, often prevented her from properly grieving or expressing vulnerability. Prince William appeared at the top of the stairs, his face grave. Behind him, Sarah could see Princess Catherine comforting Charlotte, whose shoulders shook with quiet sobs. The sight made Sarah's chest tighten with protective instinct. In her years of service, she had developed genuine affection for all the Wales children, but Charlotte's combination of strength and vulnerability had particularly touched her heart. "Sarah," Prince William called softly, "might we have a word?" Sarah climbed the stairs, noting how Charlotte's crying had subsided into the controlled sniffles the protocol demanded. Even in grief, the 11-year-old princess was already beginning to compose herself, to push down the raw emotion that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained poise. "Charlotte is understandably upset," Prince William explained, his voice carrying the weight of a father trying to balance personal grief with royal responsibility. Rebecca meant a great deal to her. "We've cancelled today's official engagements, but Charlotte is insisting that she wants to visit the stables." Sarah understood the complexity of the situation immediately. Royal protocol dictated that unscheduled visits, particularly those motivated by emotional circumstances, required extensive security planning and approval from multiple departments. The stables where Rebecca had worked were located on private property adjacent to Windsor Castle, but any movement by a member of the royal family required careful coordination. "The security implications would be significant," Sarah said carefully, recognizing that she needed to balance her protective duties with the family's emotional needs. "But I understand why she would want to go." Princess Catherine joined the conversation, her arms still around Charlotte's shoulders. "Rebecca's cottage is part of the estate where Charlotte has been taking lessons for 3 years. She knows every inch of that property, and more importantly, she needs closure. This isn't just about losing a teacher. Rebecca was one of the few people who saw Charlotte as simply a child who loved horses." The princess's words highlighted a fundamental challenge in Charlotte's life. Despite her parents' best efforts to provide normalcy, Charlotte's world was populated primarily by people who viewed her through the lens of her royal status. Teachers, staff members, and even family friends often treated her with a formality that, while respectful, created emotional distance. Rebecca had been different. A former Olympic rider who had worked with nobility and commoners alike, she had treated Charlotte with the same direct, honest approach she used with all her students. She praised Charlotte's accomplishments without excessive deference and corrected her mistakes without fear of royal displeasure. This authentic relationship had allowed Charlotte to develop genuine confidence in her abilities rather than the false confidence that often came from excessive praise. "I want to see Moonbeam," Charlotte said quietly, referring to the gentle grey mare that Rebecca had helped her train with over the past year. "Rebecca promised she would teach me to jump the new course today. I know she can't now, but I want to tell Moonbeam that Rebecca won't be coming anymore." The simplicity and sincerity of Charlotte's request struck everyone present. Here was a child trying to process loss in the most natural way possible, by saying goodbye and finding comfort with an animal that represented happier times. Yet the machinery of royal protection made even this simple desire complicated. Sarah looked at Charlotte's tear-stained face and made a decision that would ultimately reshape how she approached her protective duties. "Your Royal Highness," she said, addressing Prince William formally, "if I might suggest a modified approach to today's schedule." Over the next hour, Sarah worked with the palace security team to develop an impromptu plan that would allow Charlotte to visit the stables while maintaining appropriate protection protocols. The plan required coordination with local police, the estate's private security force, and the royal family's communication team to ensure that any potential media attention would be managed appropriately. The complexity of arranging what should have been a simple visit highlighted the extraordinary constraints that shaped every aspect of Charlotte's life. Even in grief, the machinery of royal protocol continued to function, requiring forms to be filed, personnel to be briefed, and contingency plans to be developed. As the morning progressed, Charlotte sat quietly in the cottage's morning room, staring out at the gardens where she and Rebecca had often walked together discussing horses, riding techniques, and occasionally the challenges of growing up in the public eye. Rebecca had possessed the rare ability to offer guidance without overstepping boundaries, to provide emotional support while respecting the formal structures that governed royal life. Thornbury brought Charlotte a cup of tea and some biscuits, sitting beside her in comfortable silence. The older woman had watched Charlotte grow from a toddler into a thoughtful young girl, and she understood the depth of this particular loss. Rebecca had represented something irreplaceable in Charlotte's life, an adult who valued her for her character and abilities rather than her title. "She taught me that being brave doesn't mean not being scared," Charlotte said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "She said that real courage comes from doing what's right even when you're frightened." Eleanor nodded, understanding that Charlotte was processing more than just the loss of her riding instructor. Rebecca's lessons had extended far beyond equestrian skills, encompassing life wisdom that would serve Charlotte well in her future role as a senior royal. The stables where Rebecca had worked represented more than just a place of learning for Charlotte. They had become a sanctuary where she could experience the simple joy of working with animals, the satisfaction of mastering new skills, and the comfort of an adult relationship based on mutual respect rather than royal protocol. As Sarah finalized the security arrangements for Charlotte's visit to the stables, she reflected on the unique challenges faced by royal children in processing grief and loss. The public nature of their lives meant that even private sorrows often became subjects of public interest, requiring careful management to protect both emotional well-being and royal dignity. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows across the cottage grounds when Sarah received final approval for Charlotte's visit to the stables. The security detail would include herself, one additional protection officer, and coordination with estate security. The visit would be private, with no media presence, allowing Charlotte the space she needed to say goodbye to Rebecca in her own way. Charlotte had changed into her riding clothes, not because she planned to ride, but because Rebecca had always insisted that proper attire showed respect for the horses and the sport itself. The familiar ritual of putting on her boots and helmet seemed to provide some comfort to the grieving princess. As they prepared to leave Adelaide Cottage, Sarah observed Charlotte's demeanor carefully. The princess had regained her composure, but Sarah could see the effort it required. Royal training had taught Charlotte to present a calm exterior regardless of internal turmoil, a skill that would serve her well throughout her life, but that sometimes prevented her from fully processing difficult emotions. The drive to the stables took only 10 minutes, but it felt longer as Charlotte sat quietly in the back seat, occasionally wiping away tears that she tried to hide. Sarah understood that this visit represented more than just saying goodbye to Rebecca. It was Charlotte's first real encounter with the kind of personal loss that no amount of royal training could fully prepare her for. The stables appeared peaceful in the afternoon light, but the absence of Rebecca's familiar figure created an emptiness that was immediately apparent. Her cottage, a small stone building adjacent to the main stable block, stood silent, with drawn curtains and a wreath of white flowers hanging on the door. Charlotte stood at the gate for a long moment, gathering the courage to enter a place that would never again hold the same joy and comfort it had provided for 3 years. Sarah remained close, but tried to give the princess the space she needed to process this difficult moment in her own way. The horses in the nearby paddock seemed to sense the somber mood, moving quietly and staying close to each other rather than running and playing as they usually did. Even Moonbeam, Charlotte's favorite mare, stood quietly by the fence, as if waiting for someone who would never come again. This first part of Charlotte's story established the foundation of loss, and the beginning of a journey that would test both royal protocol and human compassion, setting the stage for the choices that would ultimately lead Sarah to break protocol for the most heartbreaking of reasons. Charlotte stood frozen at the stable gate, her small hands gripping the metal bars as she stared at the empty courtyard, where Rebecca's voice should have been calling out riding instructions. The silence felt heavy and wrong, like a favorite song with all the music missing. Sarah watched the young princess struggle with emotions that royal protocol had never taught her how to handle. "Would you like me to come with you, Your Royal Highness?" Sarah asked gently, using the formal address that protocol required even in private moments. Charlotte shook her head, then paused and looked back at Sarah with eyes that seemed too old for her 11-year-old face. "Actually, yes. But could you just call me Charlotte today? Rebecca always said titles don't matter to horses." The request was simple, but it represented a significant departure from established protocol. Royal protection officers were trained to maintain formal relationships with their charges, using proper titles and observing strict professional boundaries. However, Sarah could see that Charlotte needed something more human in this moment of raw grief. "Of course, Charlotte," Sarah replied, her voice softer than usual. "Let's go see Moonbeam." They walked through the stable yard together, their footsteps echoing off the cobblestones that Rebecca had walked countless times before. The familiar smells of hay, leather, and horses usually brought Charlotte immediate comfort, but today they only served as painful reminders of what she had lost. Moonbeam nickered softly when she saw Charlotte approaching, trotting over to the fence with the eager anticipation that had always characterized their relationship. The grey mare had been Charlotte's partner in learning to jump, to develop balance and confidence, and to understand the deep connection possible between human and animal. "Hello, beautiful girl," Charlotte whispered, reaching through the fence to stroke Moonbeam's velvet nose. "I suppose Rebecca told you she wouldn't be coming today, didn't she?" Dad said. Sarah felt her throat tighten as she watched Charlotte try to explain death to a horse, searching for words to make sense of something that defied all logic and fairness. The princess's voice remained steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she continued petting Moonbeam. Tom Harrison, the head groom who had worked alongside Rebecca for 15 years, appeared from the main stable building. His eyes were red-rimmed with grief, and his usually cheerful demeanor had been replaced by the subdued manner of someone processing an unexpected loss. "Your Royal Highness," Tom said formally, then caught himself. "I mean, Princess Charlotte. I'm so sorry about Miss Rebecca. She spoke about you constantly, you know. She was so proud of your progress." Charlotte turned toward Tom, and Sarah could see the princess fighting back fresh tears. "She was going to teach me the new jumping sequence today. We were going to practice for Windsor." "Aye, she had the whole course planned out," Tom replied, his Yorkshire accent becoming more pronounced with emotion. "Spent hours last weekend adjusting the jump heights and spacing. She wanted everything perfect for you." The mention of Rebecca's careful preparations brought a fresh wave of grief. Sarah realized that Charlotte wasn't just mourning the loss of her instructor. She was grappling with the sudden disappearance of future plans, shared dreams, and the security that came from having someone who believed in her abilities without reservation. "Could I see the course?" Charlotte asked quietly. "The one she set up for me?" Tom glanced at Sarah, unsure whether this request fell within appropriate boundaries. Sarah nodded slightly, understanding that Charlotte needed to see the physical evidence of Rebecca's care and planning, even if it would be painful.
They walked to the outdoor arena where Rebecca had indeed set up an intricate jumping course.
The jumps were arranged in a pattern that demonstrated both technical skill and artistic sensibility, with each obstacle positioned to help Charlotte develop specific riding abilities while building her confidence. Charlotte studied the course silently, her eyes tracing the path that Rebecca had envisioned her taking. Sarah could almost see the princess's mind working, remembering conversations about timing and technique, about the importance of trusting both horse and rider, about courage in the face of uncertainty. "She made it just my size," Charlotte said, her voice barely audible. "Not too easy, but not impossible either. She always knew exactly what I could handle." Sarah understood that Charlotte was describing more than just jumping heights. Rebecca had possessed the rare ability to challenge the princess appropriately, pushing her to grow without overwhelming her with expectations beyond her abilities or age. Mrs. Patterson, Rebecca's elderly housekeeper, emerged from the cottage carrying a small, wrapped package. She approached Charlotte with the careful deference required when addressing royalty, but her grief was evident in every gesture. "Your Royal Highness, Miss Rebecca left this for you. She wrapped it last week and asked me to give it to you after today's lesson. She said it was to celebrate your progress." Charlotte accepted the package with trembling hands. The wrapping paper was simple brown paper tied with ribbon, nothing fancy or formal, exactly the kind of practical gift wrapping that Rebecca had always preferred. Inside was a small silver horseshoe pendant on a delicate chain, engraved with the words, "For Courage and Friendship, RF. NTPAO, Patterson explained. She said every good rider needs a talisman, something to remind them of their strength when they're feeling uncertain. Charlotte held the pendant up to the light, watching it catch the afternoon sun. The gesture seemed to crystallize something for the young princess, and when she looked up at Sarah, her expression had changed from pure grief to something more complex. "Sarah, I want to ride Moonbeam today, just once around the arena." The request sent immediate alarm bells ringing in Sarah's mind. Royal protocol strictly prohibited any unscheduled activities that could pose physical risk, and horseback riding definitely fell into that category. More importantly, Charlotte was emotionally distraught, making any physical activity potentially dangerous. "Charlotte, I understand the impulse, but riding when you're upset can be dangerous." "Protocol requires." "Please," Charlotte interrupted, her voice carrying a note of desperation that Sarah had never heard before. "Rebecca always said that horses can sense our emotions and help us process them. I need to feel connected to her somehow, and riding Moonbeam is the only way I know how." Sarah found herself facing a dilemma that her training had not adequately prepared her for. The logical, professional response was clear: refuse the request, explain the safety and protocol concerns, and suggest alternative ways for Charlotte to process her grief. However, looking at the princess's face, Sarah saw something that made her reconsider. Charlotte wasn't making this request from a place of reckless emotion or childish desire. Instead, she seemed to be reaching for a kind of healing that connected to everything Rebecca had taught her about courage, trust, and the therapeutic power of the human-animal bond. Tom had been listening to the conversation and stepped forward with a suggestion. "If I might say, there's a compromise that could work. Princess Charlotte could ride Moonbeam in the small enclosed ring, just at a walk, with full safety equipment and multiple spotters. Sarah considered Tom's proposal. The small ring was completely enclosed, with high fencing and a soft sand surface designed specifically for beginning riders. It would allow Charlotte to experience the connection with Moonbeam while minimizing physical risk. The insurance and liability issues alone, Sarah began, but Charlotte cut her off. Rebecca taught me that sometimes you have to take calculated risks to grow, Charlotte said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. She said that's what courage really means. Not being fearless, but choosing to act despite your fears. Sarah realized that Charlotte was asking for more than just a horseback ride. The princess was requesting permission to honor her relationship with Rebecca in the way that felt most authentic to both of them. Denying this request might protect Charlotte physically, but it would also deny her the opportunity to process grief in a way that connected to everything Rebecca had tried to teach her. After a long moment of internal struggle, Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. All right, Charlotte, but we do this safely, with every precaution possible. The next hour involved careful preparation that demonstrated just how seriously everyone took Charlotte's safety. Tom prepared Moonbeam with extra attention, checking every piece of equipment twice. Sarah coordinated with the estate security team to ensure that medical assistance would be immediately available if needed. Charlotte put on her helmet and safety vest with the careful attention to detail that Rebecca had always insisted upon. Even in grief, she followed every safety protocol, demonstrating the respect for proper procedures that her instructor had drilled into her over 3 years of lessons. When Charlotte finally mounted Moonbeam, something shifted in her demeanor. The horse seemed to understand the solemnity of the moment, standing perfectly still while Charlotte settled into the saddle. The connection between girl and horse was immediately apparent to everyone watching. "Easy, beautiful," Charlotte whispered to Moonbeam as they began walking slowly around the small ring. "We're doing this for Rebecca." Sarah watched from the fence, her radio ready, and her eyes trained on Charlotte's every movement. Despite her concerns about protocol, she found herself moved by the sight of the young princess finding comfort and connection in the way Rebecca had always intended. As Charlotte and Moonbeam completed their slow circuit of the ring, something remarkable happened. The tension that had gripped Charlotte's shoulders all day began to ease. Her breathing deepened, and for the first time since learning of Rebecca's death, she seemed to be finding a moment of peace. "Rebecca always said that horses don't understand royal titles," Charlotte called to Sarah as they walked past. "They only understand whether you're being honest with them." The observation struck Sarah as profoundly wise for an 11-year-old, and she realized that Rebecca's influence on Charlotte extended far beyond riding instruction. The older woman had been teaching Charlotte about authenticity, trust, and the importance of relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation or hierarchy. After 20 minutes of careful walking, Charlotte dismounted with Tom's assistance. Her face was still sad, but some of the desperate grief had been replaced by a calmer sorrow that seemed more manageable. "Thank you," Charlotte said to Sarah, her voice formal again but carrying genuine gratitude. "I know you weren't supposed to let me do that." Sarah realized that Charlotte understood exactly what had just happened. The princess recognized that protocol had been bent, that special considerations had been made, and that these actions carried both professional risk and personal significance. "Sometimes the right thing and the proper thing aren't the same thing," Sarah replied, surprised by her own words. As they prepared to leave the stables, Charlotte asked to visit Rebecca's cottage one last time. The small stone building looked peaceful in the late afternoon light, surrounded by the flower garden that Rebecca had tended with the same care she brought to training horses and riders. Charlotte stood at the cottage door for several minutes, not speaking but clearly processing emotions and memories. Sarah remained nearby, understanding that this moment represented Charlotte's private goodbye to someone who had been far more than just an instructor. "She taught me that being a princess means more than wearing crowns and attending ceremonies," Charlotte said finally. She said it means being brave enough to care about others even when it's difficult. The wisdom in Charlotte's words struck Sarah forcefully. Rebecca had been preparing Charlotte not just to ride horses, but to navigate the complex responsibilities that would define her adult life. The lessons about courage, authenticity, and service had been woven into every riding session, every conversation, every moment of guidance. As they drove back to Adelaide Cottage, Charlotte sat quietly in the back seat, fingering the silver horseshoe pendant that Rebecca had left for her. The day had been emotionally exhausting, but Sarah could see that Charlotte had found some measure of peace through their visit to the stables. However, as they approached the cottage, Sarah noticed unusual activity around the building. Several additional security vehicles were present, and personnel who weren't part of the regular detail were stationed around the perimeter. "What's happening?" Charlotte asked, noticing the increased security presence. Sarah's radio crackled with urgent communication that made her stomach drop. The unauthorized visit to the stables, despite being conducted with full safety precautions, had triggered a formal security review. More troubling, someone had photographed Charlotte at the stables, and images were already beginning to circulate on social media. The day that had begun with private grief was about to become a public relations situation that would test not only Sarah's professional judgment, but also her growing personal attachment to the young princess she had sworn to protect. The decisions made in the next few hours would determine whether Sarah's choice to bend protocol would be understood as appropriate professional flexibility or viewed as a serious breach of royal security procedures. Charlotte seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, and her expression grew more guarded as they approached the cottage. The 11-year-old princess was already learning to recognize the signs that her private moments were about to become public scrutiny, another lesson that came with her extraordinary life, but one that Rebecca had never been able to teach her how to handle. The atmosphere at Adelaide Cottage had transformed completely by the time Sarah and Charlotte returned from the stables. What should have been a quiet family evening spent processing grief had become a crisis management situation involving senior palace officials, security personnel, and media relations specialists. Commander James Mitchell, the head of Royal Protection, was waiting in the cottage's main sitting room along with Sir Robert Hastings, the Prince of Wales's private secretary. Both men wore expressions that made Sarah's stomach clench with dread. She had seen those looks before, usually preceding formal disciplinary proceedings. "Detective Inspector Matthews," Commander Mitchell said formally as soon as Charlotte had been escorted upstairs by her nanny, "we need to discuss this afternoon's activities." Sarah had anticipated this conversation, but the speed and seriousness of the response surprised her. Royal Protection operated on principles of risk assessment and adherence to established protocols. Any deviation, regardless of the circumstances, triggered immediate review processes designed to prevent future security breaches. The photographs started appearing on social media approximately 45 minutes ago, Sir Robert explained, placing his tablet on the coffee table to show Sarah the images. Someone with a telephoto lens managed to capture Princess Charlotte riding at the estate. The images are already being shared across multiple platforms. Sarah studied the photographs with growing concern. While they showed Charlotte engaged in what appeared to be a normal riding lesson, the timing and circumstances created a more complex narrative. The images suggested that the royal family was conducting business as usual, despite the tragic loss of Charlotte's instructor, which could be interpreted as callous disregard for Rebecca's death. "The security implications are significant," Commander Mitchell continued. "The unauthorized deviation from approved schedules, the failure to conduct proper advance reconnaissance, and the exposure of Princess Charlotte to uncontrolled photography all represent serious protocol violations." Sarah understood the gravity of the situation, but she also recognized that the officials were evaluating the day's events without understanding the emotional context that had driven her decisions. Royal protection protocols were designed to handle standard situations, but they often proved inadequate when dealing with the complex human needs of the people they were meant to protect. "Sir, if I might explain the circumstances that led to today's decisions," Sarah began. But Commander Mitchell raised his hand to stop her. "The circumstances are irrelevant, Detective Inspector. Princess Charlotte's safety and security cannot be compromised for any reason, regardless of emotional considerations. Your primary responsibility is protection, not providing therapeutic support." The rebuke was professionally delivered but stung nonetheless. Sarah had spent 8 years in royal protection, maintaining an exemplary record of service while building relationships with multiple members of the royal family. Today's events represented the first time she had prioritized emotional needs over strict protocol adherence. Upstairs, Charlotte was struggling with her own crisis. The princess had overheard enough of the conversation below to understand that Sarah was facing professional consequences for allowing the stable visit. The 11-year-old's sense of justice was deeply offended by the idea that kindness and compassion were being treated as professional failures. "It's not fair," Charlotte said to her nanny, Miss Sophie Clark, who had been caring for the Wales children for 4 years. "Sarah was only trying to help me say goodbye to Rebecca properly." Miss Clark found herself in a delicate position, wanting to provide comfort to Charlotte while not criticizing the security decisions that govern their lives. Royal staff members were trained to support the family while maintaining appropriate boundaries, but situations like this often tested those limits. "Sometimes grown-up decisions are complicated, Your Royal Highness," Miss Clark replied carefully. "Inspector Matthews was trying to do what she thought was best for you." Charlotte's response revealed wisdom beyond her years, Rebecca always said that doing the right thing sometimes means accepting difficult consequences.
If Sarah gets in trouble for helping me, then I should face consequences too.
Downstairs, the crisis meeting continued with increasing intensity. The palace media team had prepared statements designed to control the narrative around the photographs, but the underlying security concerns remained unresolved. Detective Inspector Matthews will be reassigned effective immediately, Commander Mitchell announced. Princess Charlotte's protection detail requires personnel who prioritize protocol compliance above all other considerations. The decision hit Sarah like a physical blow. Over 6 months, she had developed not just professional responsibility for Charlotte, but genuine care for the young princess's well-being. The idea of leaving Charlotte during this difficult time felt like abandoning someone who had trusted her with both physical safety and emotional vulnerability. Sir, with respect, I believe continuity of care is particularly important during periods of emotional stress, Sarah said, making one last attempt to advocate for Charlotte's needs. Princess Charlotte has experienced a significant loss today, and disrupting her security arrangements could compound that trauma. Sir Robert consulted his notes before responding. The palace's position is that professional boundaries must be maintained. Detective Inspector Matthews, your service has been exemplary until today, but this incident demonstrates a concerning lack of judgment that could compromise future security decisions. Sarah realized that arguing further would only make the situation worse for everyone involved. Royal institutions operated on principles of hierarchy and protocol that left little room for individual interpretation, regardless of circumstances. Her choice to prioritize Charlotte's emotional needs had been correct from a human perspective, but wrong from an institutional standpoint. However, before Sarah could respond to her reassignment, Charlotte appeared at the top of the stairs. The princess had clearly been listening to the conversation, and her face showed a combination of determination and distress that immediately caught everyone's attention. "I need to speak with you," Charlotte announced, addressing the room with the authoritative tone she rarely used, but that carried the unmistakable weight of royal command. The adults in the room found themselves in an unprecedented situation. Royal children, even princess, were typically excluded from discussions about security arrangements and personnel decisions. However, Charlotte's tone and demeanor suggested that she considered herself a stakeholder in decisions affecting her own protection.
Your Royal Highness, these matters are not appropriate for your involvement, Sir Robert said gently but firmly.
Charlotte descended the stairs with the composed dignity that royal training had instilled in her, but her eyes blazed with an intensity that reminded everyone present that she was both a child processing grief and a future monarch learning to exercise authority. "Inspector Matthews helped me today when I needed it most," Charlotte said, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of her words. "If she's being punished for showing kindness, then I want to understand why kindness is considered a professional failure." The directness of Charlotte's question caught the adults off guard. Royal children were taught to accept decisions made by adults without extensive explanation, but Charlotte was clearly questioning the logic behind punishing behavior that had demonstrated care and compassion. Commander Mitchell attempted to explain the situation in terms appropriate for a child. "Princess Charlotte, security decisions must be based on safety protocols, not personal feelings. Inspector Matthews made choices that potentially compromised your protection." Charlotte's response demonstrated both her intelligence and her growing understanding of the complex world she inhabited. "But I was never unsafe today. Inspector Matthews made sure I wore all my safety equipment, that Tom was there to help, and that medical assistance was available. How is that compromising my protection?" Sarah watched this exchange with growing admiration for Charlotte's courage and clarity. The princess was articulating arguments that Sarah herself had been unable to make effectively, demonstrating a natural ability to identify the core issues in complex situations. The unauthorized deviation from scheduled activities created risks that weren't properly assessed, Sir Robert explained. But even as he spoke, Sarah could see that Charlotte's questions were forcing the adults to examine their assumptions. "Then why don't you assess the risks properly next time instead of punishing people for being human?" Charlotte asked with the devastating logic that only children possess. The room fell silent as the adults processed the implications of Charlotte's statement. The princess had identified a fundamental flaw in current protocols. They were designed to prevent risk rather than manage it appropriately, often resulting in responses that were technically correct but humanly inadequate. Prince William appeared in the doorway, having heard enough of the conversation to understand what was happening. His expression showed the complex emotions of a father trying to balance protection of his daughter with respect for the institutional frameworks that governed their lives. "Charlotte," he said gently, "why don't you come with me so these gentlemen can finish their discussion?" But Charlotte stood her ground with a determination that surprised everyone present.
Papa, Inspector Matthews is being punished for helping me grieve properly.
Rebecca taught me that sometimes we have to stand up for people who show us kindness, even when it's difficult. Prince William found himself caught between multiple loyalties: his role as Charlotte's father, his respect for security protocols, and his recognition that his daughter was making valid points about justice and human decency. "The security protocols exist to protect you, Charlotte," he explained, but his tone suggested that he was struggling with the situation as much as anyone else in the room. "I know that, Papa. But protection shouldn't mean that people get punished for caring about us as human beings, instead of just as royal persons." Charlotte's distinction between being protected as a royal person versus being cared for as a human being struck everyone in the room forcefully. She had identified the central tension in royal life, the constant struggle between institutional requirements and personal needs. Sarah realized that Charlotte was fighting for more than just her continued service as a protection officer. The princess was advocating for a model of royal service that recognized emotional and psychological well-being as components of protection, not obstacles to it. "Your Royal Highness," Sarah said, addressing Charlotte formally but with deep respect, "I appreciate your support, but these decisions are made by people with much more experience than either of us." Charlotte turned to face Sarah directly, her expression showing maturity that seemed impossible in someone so young.
Rebecca told me that experience without wisdom is just repeated mistakes.
Maybe it's time for some new kinds of experience. The challenge implicit in Charlotte's words was unmistakable. She was suggesting that current approaches to royal protection might need fundamental reconsideration, that protocols designed decades ago might not adequately serve the needs of contemporary royal children. Commander Mitchell found himself in an extraordinarily difficult position. His professional instincts demanded adherence to established procedures, but Charlotte's arguments were forcing him to confront the possibility that those procedures might be inadequate for current circumstances. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Princess Catherine, who had been coordinating with the media team about responses to the social media photographs. Her entrance changed the dynamic in the room immediately, as everyone recognized that she brought both a mother's perspective and considerable experience in managing the balance between public duty and private life. "I've been reviewing the photographs and the circumstances of today's events," Princess Catherine announced, her tone suggesting that she had reached conclusions that might surprise everyone present. The tension in the room shifted as everyone waited to hear her assessment. Princess Catherine's opinions carried significant weight in matters affecting her children, and her approach to balancing royal duties with family needs had earned respect throughout the institution. Inspector Matthews demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment and compassion that we want in people responsible for our children's well-being, Princess Catherine said firmly. The photographs show Charlotte engaged in a therapeutic activity under appropriate supervision. If that's considered a security failure, then perhaps we need to reconsider what we mean by security. Her statement represented a direct challenge to the institutional response to the day's events, and it aligned completely with Charlotte's own arguments about the need to balance protection with human compassion. The room fell silent again as the implications of Princess Catherine's statement sank in. She was essentially arguing that Sarah's decisions had been not just acceptable but exemplary, that the official response represented institutional inflexibility rather than appropriate professional standards. Commander Mitchell realized that he was facing a situation that required more than strict adherence to existing protocols. The events of the day had revealed tensions between institutional requirements and human needs that demanded careful consideration rather than automatic disciplinary response. The crisis that had begun with unauthorized photographs was evolving into something much more significant: a fundamental examination of how royal protection could evolve to better serve the complex needs of contemporary royal children while maintaining appropriate safety standards. The standoff in Adelaide Cottage's sitting room continued as Princess Catherine's words hung in the air like a challenge to everything the royal protection establishment had assumed about proper procedure. Commander Mitchell found himself caught between institutional loyalty and the growing realization that the traditional approaches to royal security might need fundamental reconsideration. "Ma'am," Commander Mitchell said carefully, addressing Princess Catherine with the formal respect her position demanded, "while I appreciate your perspective, the security implications of today's events cannot be overlooked. Detective Inspector Matthews made unauthorized decisions that could have resulted in significant risk to Princess Charlotte." Princess Catherine's response demonstrated why she had become such an effective advocate for modernizing royal approaches to family life. "Commander Mitchell, with respect, Princess Charlotte was never in danger today. She was supervised by experienced professionals used appropriate safety equipment, and engaged in an activity she has done hundreds of times before. The only difference was that the decision was made from compassion rather than following a predetermined schedule. Charlotte watched this exchange with fascination, recognizing that the adults were debating fundamental questions about how royal life should balance institutional requirements with human needs. At 11 years old, she was witnessing a pivotal moment that would influence how future royal children experience protection and care. Sir Robert consulted his notes again, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. The precedent we set today will influence how protection decisions are made for all royal family members. If we allow emotional considerations to override established protocols, we risk creating situations where security personnel make inappropriate judgments based on personal feelings rather than professional training. Sarah realized that Sir Robert was articulating legitimate institutional concerns, but his argument assumed that emotional considerations and professional judgment were necessarily incompatible. Her experience suggested otherwise. Understanding the emotional needs of the people she protected actually enhanced her ability to make appropriate security decisions. Sir Robert, Sarah said, choosing her words carefully, in 8 years of royal protection, I've learned that understanding the emotional state of the people we protect is essential to effective security. Princess Charlotte's grief today was real and profound. Ignoring those emotional needs wouldn't have eliminated them. It would have simply forced her to process them in less healthy ways. Charlotte stepped forward, clearly determined to participate in a conversation that she considered directly relevant to her own life. May I ask a question? The adults in the room found themselves in unfamiliar territory. Royal protocols provided clear guidelines for interactions between children and adults, but those protocols had been developed for formal occasions, not for crisis management meetings where the child in question was making substantive arguments about their own care. Prince William nodded to Charlotte, recognizing that his daughter's perspective was not just relevant but potentially crucial to resolving the situation constructively. If Inspector Matthews had followed all the proper protocols today, what would have happened? Charlotte asked, her question directed at Commander Mitchell, but clearly intended for everyone present. Commander Mitchell considered the question carefully before responding. You would have remained at the cottage, where grief counselors and family members would have provided appropriate support for processing your loss. Charlotte's follow-up question demonstrated the logical thinking that impressed everyone who worked with her. And would those grief counselors have understood what Rebecca meant to me as a riding instructor and mentor? Would they have known that my relationship with horses is how I process difficult emotions? The question struck at the heart of the debate about personalized versus standardized approaches to royal care. Charlotte was pointing out that generic professional support, while well-intentioned, might not address the specific emotional needs created by her unique circumstances and relationships. Professional counselors are trained to work with children experiencing grief regardless of the specific circumstances, Sir Robert replied, but his tone suggested that he recognized the weakness in this argument. But Rebecca wasn't just anyone to me, Charlotte explained, with the patient tone she might use to explain something obvious to a younger child. She was the person who taught me that being scared doesn't mean being weak, that horses can sense authenticity, and that courage means choosing to care about others even when it's difficult. A stranger couldn't possibly understand those specific lessons well enough to help me process her death properly. Princess Catherine smiled slightly at Charlotte's articulate defense of the day's events, recognizing that her daughter was demonstrating exactly the kind of thoughtful analysis that Rebecca's mentorship had fostered. Charlotte makes an important point, Princess Catherine said, addressing the room but keeping her eyes on Commander Mitchell. The people we protect aren't interchangeable units requiring identical care. They're individuals with specific relationships, particular emotional needs, and unique ways of processing difficult experiences. Sarah felt a surge of gratitude toward Princess Catherine, who was articulating arguments that Sarah herself had been unable to make effectively in her own defense. More importantly, Princess Catherine was advocating for a model of royal protection that recognized psychological and emotional well-being as components of comprehensive security. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the sitting room door. Mrs. Jenny Thornbury appeared with a tea service, her timing suggesting that she understood the gravity of the discussion taking place. I thought everyone might benefit from some refreshment, Mrs. Organ, Thornbury said diplomatically, but as she arranged the tea things, she spoke quietly to Charlotte. Your Royal Highness, Miss Rebecca would be very proud of how you're honoring her memory today. Charlotte's eyes filled with tears at Mrs. Thornbury's words, but she maintained her composure as she continued advocating for Sarah's position. The comment seemed to strengthen her resolve rather than undermining her emotional stability. Inspector Matthews helped me honor Rebecca properly today, Charlotte said, her voice carrying new strength. She understood that saying goodbye needed to happen where Rebecca and I shared our best memories, not in some formal setting with people who never knew her. Commander Mitchell was beginning to recognize that the situation required more nuanced analysis than traditional protocol reviews typically involved. Charlotte's arguments, supported by her parents' perspectives, were forcing him to consider whether current security protocols adequately served the complex needs of contemporary royal children. "Your Royal Highness," Commander Mitchell said, addressing Charlotte directly for the first time in the conversation, "help me understand something. If security personnel are expected to make decisions based on emotional considerations, how do we ensure that those decisions don't compromise your safety?" Charlotte's response demonstrated the depth of thought she had given to questions about balancing freedom with protection. "The same way we make any important decisions. We gather information, consider different options, and choose the approach that serves the most important goals. Today, Inspector Matthews gathered information about what I needed, considered the safety implications, and made decisions that protected both my physical safety and my emotional well-being." Sarah watched Charlotte advocate for a decision-making model that balanced multiple factors rather than prioritizing protocol compliance above all other considerations. The princess was essentially arguing for a more sophisticated approach to risk management that considered psychological and emotional factors alongside physical security concerns. Prince William had been listening to the conversation with growing admiration for his daughter's maturity and clarity.
Charlotte, you're describing a decision-making process that requires considerable judgment and experience.
How do we ensure that security personnel have the skills necessary to make those complex determinations? Charlotte's answer surprised everyone in the room. The same way we ensure that people have the skills for any complex job. We train them, we give them experience, and we trust them to use good judgment. Inspector Matthews has been protecting our family for years. If we don't trust her judgment by now, then either we hired the wrong person or we're not very good at developing the people who work for us. The logic of Charlotte's argument was undeniable, and it highlighted a fundamental question about how royal institutions developed and supported their personnel. Were security officers expected to be mindless enforcers of predetermined rules, or were they trusted professionals capable of exercising appropriate judgment in complex situations? Sir Robert realized that the conversation had evolved beyond the specific question of Sarah's reassignment to broader issues about institutional flexibility and personnel development. "Your Royal Highness raises important questions about how we prepare people to serve the royal family effectively. Rebecca always said that good teachers don't just follow lesson plans, they adapt to what their students need in real time," Charlotte replied. "Maybe good protection officers need to work the same way." Princess Catherine recognized that Charlotte was advocating for a fundamental shift in how royal protection approached its responsibilities. Rather than simply preventing bad things from happening, protection personnel would be expected to actively support the psychological and emotional well-being of the people they served. "The institutional implications of this approach would be significant," Commander Mitchell said, clearly thinking through the practical challenges of implementing more flexible, judgment-based security protocols. Charlotte's response demonstrated remarkable understanding of institutional change processes. All important improvements require institutional changes. The question isn't whether change is necessary, it's whether we're brave enough to make changes that serve people better. Sarah realized that Charlotte was describing exactly the kind of courage that Rebecca had tried to teach her, the willingness to do what was right even when it was difficult or uncertain. The princess was demonstrating that lesson by advocating for approaches that prioritized human needs alongside institutional requirements. The room fell silent as everyone processed the implications of Charlotte's arguments. The 11-year-old princess had systematically dismantled the case for purely protocol-driven security approaches, while advocating for more sophisticated, person-centered methods that balanced multiple considerations. "Your Royal Highness," Commander Mitchell said finally, his tone reflecting genuine respect for Charlotte's contributions to the discussion. "You've given us much to consider. Perhaps this situation requires more thorough analysis than traditional disciplinary procedures typically involve." Charlotte recognized that Commander Mitchell was suggesting a more comprehensive review of the day's events, one that might consider the broader questions she had raised about balancing institutional requirements with human needs. "I hope that analysis will include consideration of what Inspector Matthews actually accomplished today," Charlotte said. "She helped me process grief in a healthy way, maintained appropriate safety precautions, and demonstrated the kind of judgment and compassion that I hope will characterize all the people responsible for our family's well-being." Princess Catherine smiled at her daughter's sophisticated summary of the day's events. Charlotte had transformed a potential disciplinary crisis into an opportunity to examine and improve how royal institutions served the people they were designed to protect. The conversation was moving toward a resolution that would require all parties to consider new approaches to balancing institutional requirements with personal needs, setting the stage for decisions that would influence not just Sarah's career, but the broader evolution of royal protection philosophy. As the afternoon light faded outside Adelaide Cottage, everyone in the sitting room understood that they were participating in a pivotal moment in the ongoing development of how royal families balanced public duties with private needs, institutional requirements with human compassion. 3 weeks had passed since the events at the stables, and the ripple effects of that day continued to reshape how royal protection approached its responsibilities. Commander Mitchell had initiated a comprehensive review of security protocols, but more importantly, he had begun consulting with child development experts, grief counselors, and educational specialists to better understand how security decisions affected the psychological well-being of royal children. Sarah remained on Charlotte's protection detail, but her role had evolved significantly. The crisis meeting at Adelaide Cottage had resulted in the development of new protocols that formally recognized emotional and psychological needs as components of comprehensive protection. Sarah found herself participating in training sessions designed to help protection officers develop better judgment about when flexibility serves security goals better than rigid adherence to predetermined procedures. Charlotte had returned to school at Lambrook, but the loss of Rebecca continued to influence her daily life in profound ways. The silver horseshoe pendant had become a constant companion, worn every day as a reminder of the lessons about courage and authenticity that Rebecca had worked so hard to instill. The Windsor Horse Show approached with complicated emotions for Charlotte. What should have been a celebration of her riding progress had become a memorial to Rebecca's influence and a test of Charlotte's ability to honor her instructor's memory through continued growth and achievement.
I keep wondering what Rebecca would say about my jumping form, Charlotte confided to Sarah during one of their morning walks around the cottage grounds.
She always knew exactly how to help me improve without making me feel inadequate. Sarah had learned to navigate these conversations carefully, providing emotional support while maintaining appropriate professional boundaries. The new protocols recognized that protection officers needed skills beyond physical security, but they also established clear guidelines for when specialist support might be more appropriate than well-intentioned amateur counseling.
What do you think she would say? Sarah asked, using the reflective questioning techniques she had learned in recent training sessions.
Charlotte considered the question seriously, a habit that Rebecca had encouraged in all their interactions. She would probably notice that I'm rushing my approach to the jumps because I'm nervous about competing without her guidance. She always said that anxiety makes us hurry when we should be patient. The insight demonstrated how thoroughly Rebecca's teaching had been internalized. Charlotte was learning to be her own instructor, applying lessons about self-awareness and emotional regulation that would serve her throughout her life, not just in equestrian activities. Prince William had been following Charlotte's progress carefully, and he had requested regular briefings on how the new protection protocols were working in practice. The changes initiated by the crisis at the stables were being watched closely by other royal households, as everyone recognized that Charlotte's situation had broader implications for how royal children experience protection and support. The new approaches seemed to be serving Charlotte well, Sarah reported during one of these briefings. She's processing her grief in healthy ways while maintaining her commitment to activities that Rebecca considered important for her development. Prince William nodded, but his expression suggested ongoing concern. The public interest in Charlotte's story has been more intense than we anticipated. The photographs from the stables generated significant media coverage, and there's continued speculation about how we're handling Rebecca's death and Charlotte's emotional response. The media attention had indeed been substantial, but it had taken a surprising direction. Rather than criticizing the royal family for allowing Charlotte to ride during a period of grief, most coverage had praised the decision to allow the princess to process her loss in an authentic, age-appropriate way. Editorial writers had noted that the royal family's approach demonstrated a healthy balance between institutional responsibilities and human needs. Child development experts interviewed by various media outlets had praised the decision to allow Charlotte to maintain connections to activities and relationships that provided comfort during a difficult period. The public response has been overwhelmingly positive, Sir Robert reported during another briefing. People seem to appreciate seeing royal children treated as real individuals with genuine emotional needs, rather than as symbols who are expected to maintain perfect composure regardless of circumstances. Princess Catherine had been particularly pleased with this response, as it validated her long-standing advocacy for approaches to royal life that prioritized the psychological well-being of royal children. Charlotte's experience is helping people understand that effective protection includes emotional support, not just physical security. However, the most significant changes were happening within royal institutions themselves. The protocols developed in response to Charlotte's situation were being studied by protection details for other royal family members, and similar flexibility was being introduced into various aspects of royal children's education and development. Charlotte's riding instructor at Lambrook had noticed remarkable growth in the princess's independence and decision-making abilities. She's become much more thoughtful about assessing risks and making choices, the instructor reported. It's as if she's learned to apply lessons about courage and judgment to every aspect of her riding, not just specific techniques. The observation reflected exactly what Rebecca had hoped to achieve through her mentorship. Rather than simply teaching Charlotte to ride horses, Rebecca had been developing the princess's capacity for thoughtful decision-making, emotional resilience, and authentic self-expression.
As the Windsor Horse Show approached, Charlotte made a decision that surprised everyone involved in her care.
She requested permission to dedicate her performance to Rebecca's memory, with any prize money donated to a fund supporting young riders from disadvantaged backgrounds.
Rebecca always said that privilege comes with responsibility, Charlotte explained to her parents.
She believed that people who have advantages should use them to create opportunities for others. The request required coordination with show organizers, media representatives, and various charitable organizations, but it also represented exactly the kind of thoughtful leadership that Rebecca had hoped to encourage in Charlotte. Sarah found herself playing a complex role in supporting Charlotte's charitable initiative. The new protocols recognized that protection officers might need to facilitate activities that went beyond traditional security responsibilities, but they also required careful coordination with specialists who understood charitable work and media relations. This project is helping Charlotte channel her grief into positive action, Sarah observed during planning meetings. She's honoring Rebecca's memory while developing her own capacity for leadership and service. The week before the Windsor Horse Show, Charlotte requested a private visit to Rebecca's grave. The request was handled much more smoothly than the stable visit had been 3 weeks earlier, demonstrating how quickly the new protocols had been integrated into routine operations. Charlotte placed fresh flowers on Rebecca's grave and spent several minutes in quiet reflection. Sarah remained nearby, but allowed the princess the privacy she needed for this important goodbye. I wanted to tell her about the horse show and the scholarship fund, Charlotte explained as they walked back to the car. I think she would be proud that I'm using riding to help other people, not just for my own enjoyment. The observation reflected the depth of Rebecca's influence on Charlotte's understanding of her role and responsibilities. The princess was learning to view her talents and opportunities as tools for service rather than simply personal accomplishments. On the day of the Windsor Horse Show, Charlotte's composure and confidence impressed everyone present. She rode with the technical skill that Rebecca had helped her develop, but more importantly, she demonstrated the emotional maturity and grace under pressure that had been Rebecca's most important lessons. Charlotte's performance was nearly flawless, earning her second place in a highly competitive field. However, the real measure of her success was evident in her post-competition interview, where she spoke eloquently about Rebecca's influence and the importance of using advantages to help others. Miss Rebecca taught me that courage isn't about not being scared, Charlotte told the interviewer, fingering her horseshoe pendant. It's about choosing to do the right thing even when you're uncertain about the outcome. Sarah watched from the sidelines, feeling profound pride in Charlotte's growth and resilience. The events that had begun with unauthorized photographs and disciplinary proceedings had evolved into a fundamental improvement in how royal protection approached its responsibilities. The scholarship fund announced at the horse show raised significant money and media attention, but more importantly, it established Charlotte as a young leader who understood how to transform personal experiences into broader social good. In the months that followed, the protocols developed in response to Charlotte's situation were formally adopted across royal protection services. Training programs were expanded to include modules on child development, grief counseling, and decision-making in emotionally complex situations. Sarah's career had been enhanced rather than damaged by her decision to prioritize Charlotte's emotional needs alongside her physical security. She was promoted to a senior role in developing and implementing the new protocols, ensuring that future protection officers would be better prepared to balance institutional requirements with human needs. Charlotte continued to excel in her riding, but she also began exploring other interests and activities that reflected Rebecca's emphasis on service and authenticity. She volunteered with local riding programs, mentored younger students, and gradually developed into exactly the kind of thoughtful, compassionate leader that Rebecca had envisioned. The silver horseshoe pendant remained a constant reminder of the lessons about courage, authenticity, and service that had emerged from tragedy. Charlotte wore it to every important event, every challenging situation, every moment when she needed to remember that real strength comes from choosing compassion even when it's difficult. Years later, when Charlotte had grown into a confident young woman preparing for her eventual role as a senior royal, she would often reflect on the day when Sarah broke protocol to help her grieve properly. The incident had taught her that effective leadership sometimes requires challenging established procedures in service of higher principles. The story of Princess Charlotte's loyal guard-breaking protocol had become a lesson about the importance of balancing institutional requirements with human needs, about the courage required to prioritize compassion over compliance, and about how personal relationships can reshape institutional practices for the better. Rebecca's influence continued through Charlotte's approach to royal duties, through the improved protocols that protected royal children more comprehensively, and through the scholarship fund that provided opportunities for young riders who might otherwise never have experienced the transformative power of working with horses. The heartbreaking reason behind Sarah's protocol breach had become the foundation for meaningful improvements in how royal institutions served the people they were designed to protect. Charlotte's grief had been transformed into positive change that would benefit countless others. Exactly the kind of outcome that Rebecca would have considered the highest possible honor to her memory. In the end, the story demonstrated that sometimes the most important acts of loyalty require breaking rules rather than following them, that genuine protection encompasses emotional and psychological well-being alongside physical security, and that wisdom often emerges from the courage to prioritize human needs over institutional convenience.